I identify as a mind, or a consciousness. You probably do too, really. But that's what I think I am. I believe other minds exist, so you're real, that's great. Always helps a conversation. And I believe that we live in a shared world. I believe in physics, chemistry, biology and science. But I don't believe that our shared world that we find ourselves in, that place you call reality, is something that's beyond mind, that it's some strange machine-like thing that isn't a mind. I'm entirely unconvinced that mind arises from dumb, physical things that we can precisely map with physics and maths. I don't really believe anything exists outside of minds or consciousness. I don't see any reason to postulate that. I'm most open to idealism, panspiritism, or panpsychism. My guest today, Tom, is a physicalist, and physicalists believe that mind somehow arises from non-mind stuff. Some of them go a little bit further and don't really believe that mind or consciousness really exist. It's all just the behaviour of physical stuff instead for them, and I find that really quite crazy. But I would love to talk to one of them and try and figure out what's going on. Am I misunderstanding something, or have they literally just lost their minds? But that's for another day. Tom doesn't take quite such an extreme stance. So, I think it should make for quite a good conversation. Now, I've adopted a very easygoing style for this meeting of minds. You see what I did there? I'm not trying to nitpick or hold Tom accountable each and every time he says something that I disagree with. What I found is that if you do that, you can really derail a conversation. So I'm letting some stuff slide in order to try and see how far I can persuade Tom with a rational approach that mind has to be a fundamental aspect of reality, or at least there's an exceptionally good case for that being so. Here's a little taster for what's coming up.
So I'm a physicalist. I think that the brain and the mind are synonymous. I mean, that would technically be one of the mistakes I think people are making, where they're using philosophy to try and understand the fundamental nature of reality. Like, I think that is fundamentally a mistake. Wait for the science, and until then, just withhold judgment. They're just kind of making stuff up. They have no idea what they're talking about. Everyone is currently wrong, and it's something else, but it's probably a product of the brain in some sense.
Is that not having your cake and eating it a little bit, saying everybody is wrong? Those people who say the thing that I agree with are not wrong. That sort of idea that science has already shown that consciousness is a product of the brain, that's something I'm very, very interested in.
Because all of the predictions are related to physical interactions, and none of the predictions have been made in reference to this consciousness stuff, that's why the majority consensus does not think the consciousness stuff is its own kind of a thing. You're missing that step of the differentiate imagination from reality. That's the one that I need for it to be taken seriously in my position. Why not just have it be more physics that we can't understand yet?
Welcome to Consciousness Matters. Let's talk physicalism. Right, okay. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for having an interview with me, Tom. This is Consciousness Matters, and I'm very interested to make sure that I'm not just getting a one-sided approach to the subject of consciousness. And I think that you'll make sure that we bring some different points of view to the table. So I suppose what I'd like to open with is, what is your perspective on the subject? What are your thoughts and feelings, and how have you looked at this over the course of the philosophy that you've done?
Yeah, so I'm a physicalist. I think that the brain and the mind are synonymous. I think that given the best evidence we have from neurology, psychology, cognitive science, the only evidence we have is that there is physical stuff and that consciousness is an emergent property of that physical stuff. It seems like the physical interactions seem to have dominance over the consciousness aspects rather than the other way around. So it seems much more reasonable to infer that the physical aspects are what constitute the consciousness stuff rather than the other way around. So, for example, if we could do more stuff with our mind than we could with the physical world, like if I could use the force or whatever, then it may make sense to say that yes, consciousness is fundamental, and you can interact with that consciousness outside of just your mind space. But since it seems like the opposite is the case, where physical interactions can affect your consciousness, but your consciousness can't affect the physical interactions, it seems to be a much better explanation to say that consciousness is an emergent property of physical stuff rather than physical stuff is an emergent property of consciousness. So my position is physicalism. I think that is supported by most of the evidence and most of the consensuses in most of academic fields in this topic.
That's interesting, right? So I don't think, so from my experiences, because I think that's probably the best place to start, because you could teach me something today. You could teach me something that I don't already know. And that may mean that I have to change my views on the subject. So one of the things that I've come across is that there seems to be, I've talked to a lot of people and I've had a look myself, and I can't see any scientific evidence that really separates out that physicalist paradigm, for example, say from something like panpsychism or idealism. So it seems, from what I've seen, that the evidence seems to suggest it doesn't unambiguously select one philosophy of mind over another. But I'm sure we'll get to that. I'm sure you disagree with that. But I was hoping that just to begin with, that you might step over where people are making mistakes in your view and how we can correct those. And also, just to be really clear as well, would you call yourself an eliminative physicalist, or do you believe in strong emergence, or am I not even asking the right questions there?
I don't take a position on any of those. Like I don't think that our understanding of consciousness is to a point where we can start delineating what it really is or how it interacts in the brain. So I don't really take that much of an interest to try and associate myself with a particular philosophical view. I just think, just wait for the neurology. It's pretty much my position.
Okay.
I don't know if I would say, I mean, that would technically be one of the mistakes I think people are making, where they're using philosophy to try and understand the fundamental nature of reality. Like, I think that is fundamentally a mistake. Like, nope, our ideas, our conceptual understanding of reality has absolutely no bearing on reality itself. Like, we've discovered some very strange things, especially in physics recently, with entanglement and the dual slit experiment, the particle duality, particle wave duality. So trying to use our imagination to come up with a model of reality is pretty much a complete waste of time. I think it's useless. You can use it to build a hypothesis, but then you need some way to verify that hypothesis corresponds to reality independent of our imagination. And without that, it's just essentially making stuff up, and that's all it is. So I don't really take philosophy that seriously, even though it's technically my job. It's more just a enterprise and imagination, and until we get that harder science kind of testable prediction method to differentiate imagination from reality, it's kind of completely useless. It's just for fun, or to categorize ideas and nothing more. So my position is wait for the science, and until then, just withhold judgment.
Is science not a subset of philosophy?
Technically, yes. Like, all roses are flowers and not all flowers are roses, but science has an added feature. So all philosophy is just making stuff up. It's just in your head, hypothesizing. Science has that added thing of it's hypothesizing and then can show the hypothesis corresponds to reality outside of your imagination. So science is better than philosophy. It's philosophy plus this added feature of not just imaginary.
Right. So This is very interesting, because this sort of tackles that. I've come across this before when talking to people, where they're very keen on sort of stressing that science is really where it's at. The philosophy, we can make all sorts of mistakes, and I find that sort of quite an interesting and a very understandable position. And I suppose also, before we carry on, I should probably note that I think that a large amount of neuroscientists are in your camp, right? They are also physicalists. I don't think you're sort of alone on an island here with anything like this. I think there's a lot of other people agreeing with you. Right, so I'm just trying to process this. So science is a subset of philosophy, but it's also more accurate than philosophy. I mean, this is quite interesting. I understand that philosophy has limitations because it's always dealing with what we think we know. And sort of the limitations of what we can imagine and what we can reason become the limitations of our philosophy. And I very much accept the idea that if we're doing science and we try to test something, then that, we have a mechanism where we can get feedback that might correct any false assumptions and things like that.
Well, actually, I just wanted to chime in there. So I kind of like thinking of it like Harry Potter and a science textbook are both categories of books, but the science textbook clearly has one additional feature that makes it more important than the Harry Potter book, in that it corresponds to reality. So just like science is a subset of philosophy and a science textbook is a subset of books, they have an added feature. So it's the philosophy plus something else, which makes it better, which is that correspondence to reality thing. And that's what philosophy is missing. Philosophy is more like the Harry Potter book, or just the category of books in general. Without that added feature to delineate real from imaginary, it doesn't really tell us much about reality. And so you need that added feature for it to be as significant.
Right. So I guess I want to try and explore how broad your position in physicalism is. Now, I think I've already sort of tried to do that a little bit by asking whether your understanding was eliminative or... So there isn't anything that we need to... There's no weird mind stuff, is what I was trying to get at. That there is no consciousness per se, just the illusion of it. So we're sort of mapping out the possible terrain here without saying which particular mountain that we've got to go for, in my understanding. So we've got eliminative physicalism or eliminative materialism, which is illusionism. And on the other hand, we've got strong emergence, but then we've also got people who sort of take this middle ground and is trying to say that consciousness is weakly emergent. So
yeah, I think they're all silly. I think they're all just farting in the wind, pretty much. Kind of like doing quantum mechanics and trying to explain entanglement or particle wave duality before we ever discovered those things. It's like they're just kind of making stuff up. They have no idea what they're talking about and could go any way. Probably has nothing to do with any of the current theories whatsoever. That's probably my interpretation. Like, everyone is wrong. That is my current guess. Everyone is currently wrong, and it's something else, but it's probably a product of the brain in some sense.
That's absolutely fascinating. Is that not having your cake and eating it a little bit, saying everybody is wrong, but those people who say the thing that I agree with are not wrong? Is that not a little bit...
Well, no, because I'm saying that, so the philosophical side, they're all wrong. So all of the ones who are saying it's eliminative materialism or minimalistic physicalism, whatever, I don't care. Like, all of it is just making stuff up. I'm going to wait with the science. The science isn't wrong here. The science says consciousness is a product of the brain. We don't know anything more than that. We're just going to stop and wait for the evidence. And that is the correct path to take. My imagination is that consciousness is probably going to be discovered to be some interesting new process of the universe, kind of like quantum physics was, where we just have this new breakthrough and we understand it differently. What that is, I don't know, and it really doesn't make a difference to me. But the way we're going to discover that is not through philosophy. Philosophy is never going to give us an answer. It's just going to be us imagining stuff. It's going to be science that gives us the answer. And so I don't really think there's much value in trying to adopt a label of the contemporary philosophers about what the mind is, because I don't think they really know anything. And so I'm going to wait for the ones that do actually give us knowledge, which is the science. I think that's the better methodology to take.
Well, I suppose I'm very keen and very hopeful that will yield results, of course. That sort of idea that science has already shown that consciousness is a product of the brain, that's something I'm very, very interested in. So I was wondering if we could sort of just elaborate on that, please.
Right. So in all of the scientific experiments we've ever done, we can do physical interactions that affect consciousness, but not the other way around. We can't use pure consciousness to do things. I can't think about lifting the TV using the force and the TV to float. Like, it just doesn't happen. Sure. So as far as we know, just limiting ourselves to using consciousness or the mechanisms within consciousness itself, it doesn't seem to have any real effect outside of my mind. And that seems to be it. Whereas the opposite seems to be very true, like any physical interaction in the world or in my brain or a scientist jabbing me with an electrode has a ton of influence over my consciousness. We can do that with all kinds of different psychedelic drugs, electrodes, epilepsy, like any kind of physical interaction in the brain seems to affect consciousness to a significant degree. So it's like if you imagine a switch or a lever. If pushing the lever one direction makes something move, a pushing it the other direction does not make it move. It seems like there's a tendency that the first direction has more significance here. This is what's important in the equation. And so the same thing kind of applies to the mind and the body. It's like, because the physical stuff seems to have so much dominance over the consciousness, and the consciousness seems to have so little, if any, influence over the physical stuff, relegated to just possibly causing certain chemical reactions in the brain to cause the body to move, and that's it. It seems highly unlikely to ascribe this consciousness stuff to be more than just a product of the brain. Like if we see dark matter, for example, dark matter is just, it's over there. It is the curvature of space-time around those galaxies. We can see there's more there. It's more than what we calculate for the normal matter, but it's only in that location. It's not like dark matter is permeating everywhere in the universe, so it's just in every single particle ever. It's in that specific location, and so it's more reasonable to think that something in that specific location is causing it, rather than to think it's some fundamental property of the universe that's only being activated in that one region for some reason.
I just want to say I'm very sympathetic to you on the notion that consciousness or the mind has no effect over the physical world, right? Okay, so I'm just going to try and remember the correct philosopher's name here. Is it John Searle? He has a show where he says, well, mind over matter is obvious. I want to raise my hand, and the damn thing goes up. And I suppose your perspective on that would be that we can reduce that down to physical causes, right? Would that be right? Sort
of. So if we just grant that idealism or dualism, just dualism is true for the sake of the argument, and say there is this consciousness stuff, well, the extent of what it can do is it can cause chemical reactions in the brain. That's it. It doesn't cause my hand to move. No, it just causes the chemical interactions in my brain, which then cascade into the physical stuff.
That, yeah.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
So if all consciousness can do is this very small function in the brain to change chemical interactions, that's still pretty insignificant. So even if we knew for a fact dualism was true, and there is this consciousness stuff and there is this material stuff, the material stuff is significantly more important. It has dominance over the consciousness stuff by a huge margin. The consciousness can barely affect the physical stuff at all. So it seems much more reasonable to think the physical stuff is the more important thing in this equation.
Interesting. So in my physicalist understanding, we're presupposing that the chemical reactions would normally turn out one particular way, but if we're sort of entertaining this dualist model, we really are speculating there's another entity involved, another thing, or whatever you want to say, that is influencing the way that these chemical reactions turn out in the brain. And I understand that the reason why science hasn't been more persuaded that this thing is real is because, well, we in all the times that we've looked in the brain so far, we don't see anything other than things going exactly according to physics. Would that be right?
Not exactly. So even if we can make testable predictions to indicate things that we'll never see, we can never see a lot of things. And before gravitational waves were seen, Einstein made tons of predictions that were confirmed. And so he didn't see gravitational waves at all, but he could still make predictions that said, yes, gravitational waves exist. We have reason, everyone in the scientific community said, yes, gravitational waves exist before we ever saw them. So the same thing could be true of dualism or idealism, where you say that there is this second kind of stuff. And if you could make a prediction about what would you see if there was this second kind of stuff that was unique to your model, a novel prediction that we didn't already expect, that would be evidence of it. We wouldn't need to directly see this new kind of stuff. We would just need to be able to say that if this kind of stuff existed, we would be able to make a novel prediction that we haven't discovered yet. And because it's never been able to do that, that's why it's never been accepted. That's why it's not really taken seriously, because all of the predictions, all of the progress in science it's a material thing. Everything in the brain is material. All of our consciousness and the relation between our conscious experience and the brain is material. And all of the predictions bear that out. So if I want to make you imagine a unicorn or whatever, the best way to do it is to stick an electrode in your brain. So because all of the predictions and novel predictions are related to physical interactions, and none of the predictions have been made in reference to this consciousness stuff, that's why no one thinks, or the majority consensus does not think, the consciousness stuff is its own kind of a thing, because there have been no corresponding novel predictions to indicate that it's actually there.
Okay, so I suppose I best explain where my thinking on this is at the moment, and then maybe if I've made something wrong, you can let me know. Made a mistake. Right. So for me, and I appreciate this is, can get quite complicated. I believe that one of the problems that we've got is that for us to be able to talk about consciousness, for us to be able to accept that perhaps that there is a hard problem of consciousness, and I'd be very interested to hear what you think about that in particular as well. For us to talk about consciousness, the only reasonable, sane source that can come from, unless we fall into illusionism and we say that consciousness isn't real, is consciousness itself. So this is something that I was really, really happy to see picked up by Annika Harris, for example. And I noticed that it's something that Sam doesn't... I've not seen Sam Harris talk about this, but his wife, in her book Consciousness, she talks about that, and I found that very interesting, because it seems to me that, and I'm trying to reason this through, that if I can talk about my own consciousness in the physical world to another mind, that we've got very direct evidence, and it would seem incontrovertible to me, but please do, have a go if you want, that for me to have something that it feels like to be me and tell somebody else that we've got that direct evidence for consciousness affecting the physical world.
Sure, yeah, I mean, we experience a phenomenon, so I grant there is a phenomenon there. There is something occurring that is this experience of consciousness. But that doesn't tell us anything about ontology. It just tells us it's there. So like one of my favorite arguments is the cogito, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
That means I exist. So I grant I exist. But what is the I? As Bertrand Russell so kindly pointed out, that when Descartes used this argument, he tried to indicate Cartesian dualism, that there's a soul thing. Like the I means I am a soul, which is kind of like the same argument you're presenting, whereas like we have this direct experience of consciousness, though consciousness must be there. Well, yeah, sort of. There definitely has to be something there, a phenomenon, but we can't use that to tell us about its ontology. What is it made of? Is it an idealistic kind of a soul thing that is really there, or is it a combination of dualism, physicalism, and idealism, or is it just materialism? We have no idea. We can't say one way or the other. All we have is we just know that there is this phenomenon, and we can say nothing about it. Other than that, we have a phenomenon, we don't know what it is.
I'm very sympathetic to this notion that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And I really agree with you there. We should take it through every logical step, and we should be sure of what we're saying, be sure of what we're talking about, rather than sort of going from step 1 to step 5. We shouldn't do that. So I think that without further reasoning, with us just saying that this phenomenon is real, then I'm very sympathetic to where you're coming from with us not sort of going, this means idealism, this means God, whatever it is. However, what I was really driving at with that is that I think that, and I think that a large amount of people in neuroscience are possibly not really considering to the full extent that if consciousness really were an epiphenomena, if it was something that was a one-way product, right? So we never say, if we were going to say, that consciousness never affects the physical world, well, if that were true, well, we wouldn't be talking about it, right?
No, I think that is presuming your conclusion again. Like, any phenomenon we see could be explained by infinitely many explanations. Like, for example, we could say that we were all created 5 minutes ago by an evil leprechaun or whatever. Now, obviously, that's a possibility. We can't rule that out. There's no way for us to prove that we weren't created 5 minutes ago by an evil leprechaun. But there's infinitely many such imaginary hypotheses that can explain anything, just literally anything. Problem of underdetermination, you can explain any set of data with infinitely many hypotheses. So, for example, Calvinism, the religious Christian position that God created us and we're all 100% determined by God's will, and so there's no free will and God just makes us believe everything that we believe. So in that case, then consciousness is kind of like an epiphenomenon. God just creates our consciousness and we experience what he wants us to experience, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's a possibility. There's no logical contradiction there. And so if he wants us to have a conversation about consciousness and free will, then we will have a conversation about consciousness and free will. So
right.
That's definitely a possibility for consciousness to be an epiphenomenon. But I think that, like all hypotheses of consciousness, that missing factor, like you mentioned the steps, we can't just start with our experience. We need to go through the steps. Well, the most important step for me is the differentiate imagination from reality step, I use novel predictions to do that. So if you have a hypothesis, if you don't do that step, it's just hypothesizing. It's just imagining ways the world could be. Logical, possible worlds, doing philosophy doesn't interest me all that much. I don't think it's going to tell me much about the way the world is, because you're missing that step of the differentiate imagination from reality. That's the one that I need for it to be taken seriously in my position. And so without taking that step, then I think we're doing what you mentioned before of just like having a phenomenon and assuming the conclusion. And so I think that step is key to really moving progress forward in the field.
I couldn't agree more. So I suppose in the limited conversation that we're having, with to the best of our ability, sort of exploring the issue and trying to think it through with each other, taking that second step to me looks like, so it seems like the first step that we've made here is sort of accepting that consciousness is real, it's a real phenomena, but we're not saying any more about it than that. I suppose what I'd like to know in trying to advance it another step, whether we can sort of like be uncertain or dispute it or accept it, whatever the outcome is for this, but it's that idea that us talking about consciousness may be a phenomena that's not coming from consciousness. I'd really like to dive into that one, because, well, in particular, because the case that I try and make on my channel a lot, and I really am, I promise you, I'm very much open to, if someone explains to me that I'm making a serious error, it'll go up there, it will just be an evolution of my channel. I'll say, I tried this particular branch, it got me to a dead end, it's time to explore the rest of it. I'm really just interested in the truth here. So just to be really clear, we're happy that consciousness is real, right?
Yeah, I mean,
in some fashion, as a phenomena.
In some fashions, which could be a limited materialism, and it's only real in some kind of illusory sense. Still, it's a phenomenon of some kind.
So when we say illusory, there, just to be careful, I'm very happy with the idea that it could be something not what it seems, that sort of illusion, and really seeing if we can sort of negotiate to take an option off the table here, because illusionism, in my understanding of philosophy of mind, is really much the hard stance at this, that you think that you're conscious, but you're not. So it feels to me like we're making a bit of progress here in where we can agree with each other, where the overlap is between what we believe in that consciousness is real, and it might be an illusion as in it's not what it seems, but it's not going to be an illusion as in it's not there really.
So I would not grant that. So again, I think that everybody's just making stuff up. So all of the philosophy is just people making stuff up. Could it all be true? Yes. It's like saying that could we be created 5 minutes ago by a leprechaun? Yes. Can I disprove it? No. I don't understand that level of eliminative illusionism. Like I don't get it.
No, me neither.
To me, it seems like a contradiction. But
yeah, absolutely.
But I would never say it's impossible, because I don't know enough about the universe to say no, you're wrong. Even though I think what you're saying is silly, like anybody saying that we were created 5 minutes ago by leprechauns. That sounds very silly to me. I don't believe it, but it's possible. I can't rule out that possibility. And so, like for example, if they were able to make testable predictions and progress the field of neurology significantly more than anybody else, then I'd be like, yep, you're right. I still don't understand it, but you're the ones, your theory is the one making predictions and making progress in the world. None of the other ones aren't. You win. I grant you're correct. So that would essentially be my position. I don't understand it, but you're right.
Wow. Right.
So I wouldn't eliminate anything purely based on my conceptual understanding. So to me, it seems like consciousness exists, but if their theory says consciousness doesn't, and theirs is the one making progress in the world and mine isn't, I'm going to grant they're right. Same kind of a thing with a God.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a really interesting view. It's I mean, it's confusing, but there's a certain amount of humbleness and humility there. I grant you that. I mean, so how certain could we get that consciousness is real? 95%? 99? 90? Where would you put yourself?
Well, I'd say that it's just unknown. Like,
right.
I don't understand the illusionism, so I can't. It's like, what is the probability that there is a? I don't know. I don't even know what that means.
You know what? I have no idea about illusionism either. To me, the idea that our subjective experience isn't real seems to undermine the scientific process where we empirically verified something. So, using our own experience to see what something was. So I don't get illusionism either. But if some smart people can come along and they can make a better argument, power to them. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Right. So my position is kind of like the God hypothesis. I'm an atheist, so I don't believe there is a God. But if Christians could start making testable predictions based off of the Bible, and it got it right, I'd be like, okay, that's real evidence of a God. I don't understand the God concept. It seems self-contradictory to me. An all good being who drowns millions of babies, like, doesn't seem coherent to me. But you make testable predictions, so you have a better understanding of reality than I do, because you can actually make progress in reality where I can't. So I'm not willing to throw any theory out just because I can't understand it or because it makes no sense to me. I think that my subjective interpretation of the theories is irrelevant. I think the only thing that matters is that second step I was mentioning earlier, that way to differentiate imagination from reality. If you can do that, then if you want to say there is a round square and it exists and you can make predictions of it and it works, then round squares exist.
Okay, right. Fantastic. That's very clear on the philosophy side of things. I suppose what I'm going to try and do next then is, because I was sort of hoping that we could go from step to step and sort of reach a certainty, but I accept the fact that you're not happy declaring anything with a degree of certainty when it comes to sort of accepting consciousness as a real phenomenon. You'd like to leave the door open for it being an illusion as in not there. So if we sort of tentatively build on what we've got, acknowledging the fact that we can't rule stuff out, I suppose I'm still very much entranced with what seems to me to be just a stunning argument that consciousness has to affect the physical world, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. And what I would like to sort of explore is if you think there are any reasonable alternatives to that. So perhaps consciousness is real, but our talking about consciousness isn't coming from us. Now, you alluded to a view that I wasn't really very familiar with here, a Kelvin view, sort of like the idea that none of us had any sort of power to make decisions. How can we reconcile that? What approach should we have to the idea that talking about consciousness proves consciousness effects on the world?
I'm not sure what you mean. So, like Calvinism, it's a branch of Christianity, thinks just God does everything, and we have absolutely zero control whatsoever. So our appearance of choice is just God making the choice for us, and we don't realize it. So if there is some ultimate determining factor and consciousness is just a domino along the line, a determined feature that really doesn't do anything, then that it's perfectly coherent to think that consciousness doesn't actually interact with the world. It's really the world causing the consciousness, and it just appears as if it does, but it doesn't.
What about the fact that we can talk about it? What about the fact that, let's say right now, that if I want to try and describe what consciousness is, I mean, I'm going to have to appeal to you understanding it, obviously, but it would be something like, that it feels like something to be me, that I have a visual field, that I witness colours, I could, rather than just sort of listing off all the colours, I'm sure that people can sort of see this for themselves if you sort of just take a moment from just being really focused into the video to just sort of appreciate your own consciousness and sort of just notice things about it, the things that you hear, this whole experience of being this subjective conscious entity. All of that seems to be knowledge that seems to sit in the zone of what you might call that conscious subjective experience that's being had by this consciousness. And I'm using these words lightly rather than, 100%. I'm trying to communicate an idea rather than sort of like be super precise with it, because I appreciate this is a complex sort of thing to sort of talk about, and it's inferred because it's not something we can point to in the objective world and go, that. So, I mean, I've just talked about my subjective experience, and we've done that. I've done that in the physical world, right? So I've sort of taken what it is that I'm feeling and experiencing, and I've witnessed that. I've witnessed myself. I'm doing it right now. I'm talking into a microphone. I can imagine the signals coming out as pressure waves from my mouth after they've gone through my brain. It's that causal chain that you mentioned earlier when it comes to lifting your arm. But all of that seems to be being brought about. I'm witnessing it coming from my consciousness. When I say that I feel happy, it sort of like I'm not just saying that I feel happy. I'm can see that my state of happiness correlates with the fact that I'm saying that I'm happy and the fact that I wanted to. And I'm trying to get my head around how we could explain that any other way. How can we say that consciousness is real, but our conversations about consciousness don't come from it? Because all that information then would be suspect. All that information would be wrong. I mean, if you want to understand, say, for example, what George Clooney thinks about something, you can't ask somebody else, because you'd have to go to George Clooney, right? You see what I'm getting at? The source of the knowledge.
So again, I'm trying to defend positions that I don't hold, but it's totally fine. So you could imagine like a movie. You mentioned George Clooney, Ocean's 11, great movie. You can say that imagine consciousnesses do exist, but essentially you're just downloading your consciousness into George Clooney. So you feel everything George Clooney does in Ocean's 11. You think everything George Clooney does in Ocean's 11. And you have this perception that you are George Clooney. You're thinking about robbing the bank. You're thinking about planning this out. You're the one initiating all these actions when you're not. Obviously, the movie's all been planned out. It's always been played. You're just experiencing it with your consciousness, and you have this false illusion that you're the one causing it. In that case, nothing George Clooney did in the movie was caused by or your consciousness. Your consciousness is just experiencing the things in the world already going on, and you have this perception that you're the one causing it. So the idea that consciousness doesn't actually interact with the world is completely fine. You have, even if consciousness existed, it could still not interact with the world. It could still just be experiencing the way the world is without doing anything to it. So there are many different ways to accomplish that. And so it's not particularly hard to imagine why it's possible that consciousness may not have an interaction with the world. Which is why I think it's more important, because the universe is weird. Like the ideas in quantum mechanics are so weird that like two particles can share or oppose spins at faster than the speed of light across the universe because of entanglement, or that waves and particles can exist simultaneously, or that the interpretations of quantum mechanics that nothing is real, everything is just a relation. Ontic structural realism. There are no chairs, there are no people. You're just a relation and some information in the universe somewhere. Like, I think the universe is so sufficiently weird that to make any conclusions about its fundamental nature based off of our intuition is completely flawed. I think that methodology is just an incorrect methodology to use. So obviously, us understanding how consciousness could be an illusion while experiencing consciousness is a very silly thing to think, like saying there is a round square or a married bachelor or whatever. But because our intuitions don't determine anything about reality, it doesn't matter how weird it is to us. What matters is what does reality say? Reality is the one that gets to say what the truth is, even if it's completely weird to us. It makes no sense to us whatsoever. So I can totally understand and empathize with your perspective that when talking about many of these ideologies, it's so strange to the point where you probably never accept them. Like I wouldn't accept illusionism either. To me, consciousness seems real, but because I know how insignificant my conception is when it comes to describing reality, I don't put much weight on that. Whereas it seems that many people who do accept idealism put significantly more weight on their ability to conceptualize as being an accurate description of reality. Whereas I'm saying my conception is just a silly human thought experiment and nothing more. And I'm going to wait for the other thing that gives me much more a clear understanding of reality.
So I suppose the thing that the thing that made my brain do some backflips there was it was the idea that our intuition can tell us that our intuition can't tell us anything. I mean, it seems like it's almost a Mysterian approach that we can never know. And I'm sort of wondering how, when we've set that up, that science can possibly rescue us after that. And I think that one of the things that sort of fascinates, well, actually, no, we do need to get back to this sort of the science angle as well, because there's stuff that I could really do with there. But no, I appreciate that sort of dive that we've done so far into this idea that the consciousness might not be causing our conversations about consciousness, even though that doesn't seem to make very much sense to me. I'd like to sympathise with you a bit, though. I'd like to lean into your position, because I am aware that people will confabulate in certain experiments. So they feel like they were responsible for something when they weren't, and that we've sort of done this in science. We've had these sorts of experiments, and that is very interesting to me.
Yeah, like the ones where they give you options between two pictures, and they say pick one of the pictures, and you go through like 5 pictures and you pick 5, and then they take some of the ones you didn't pick and put them into the ones you did pick and ask you to give a reason, why did you pick this? And then they start giving reasons for the ones they didn't pick. I picked this one because it has a pretty smile or whatever. Like, you didn't actually pick that one.
Yeah. It does mean that we are somewhat opaque to ourselves, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. Right. Right. I suppose what I'm curious about is why do you feel that science leads you to physicalism?
Because...
Why doesn't science just make you agnostic? Why not just go, you know what? I've got no idea if consciousness emerges or whether it's fundamental. I just don't know. I'm not going to use the label of physicalist because it would seem to suggest a philosophy that I just can't know. What made you go for physicalist?
So the novel testable predictions thing is my key here. So as I mentioned earlier, if Christians believe there is this all-powerful, all-knowing being, like, obviously we could never know if it was all-powerful. Like, even if we watched it create 1 billion universes, that doesn't mean it could create infinitely many universes. We could never know that the God wasn't created by a previous God. But if you can have a hypothesis that makes consistent testable predictions which are correct, like saying, I believe God is all-powerful, therefore he can create 10 million universes. He snaps his finger, creates 10 million universes. That's evidence towards the conclusion he's all-powerful, even though you could never know he's all-powerful. So you'll never be able to provide sufficient evidence to justify that he's truly all-powerful, but you do have evidence in the direction. So physicalism is the same kind of thing, where we can never know for certain that material stuff is the fundamental nature of reality. But we can use that to make predictions about how things in our brain interact. Like, if it's all material and we zap your brain in this location, you're going to see a pink elephant. We do it, you see a pink elephant. Like, okay, we can just use that as an inference that, yeah, physicalism is probably true. So because all of the progress in science and neurology and has been based off of ideas of physical interactions, and those have been able to make progress more than any other field, just like if Christians were able to make predictions about the world based off of their God belief, we can just infer that that hypothesis is true. It doesn't give us certainty. It doesn't get us all the way to the fact that God is all powerful or that there's only physical stuff in the universe. But because it's making progress, because it's getting that extra step to differentiate imagination from reality and the others aren't, we can infer that's the one that's probably true.
So I'm just going to try and voice it back to you to make sure that I'm on the same page, to make sure I understand where you're coming from. It would be something like, it's probably only the laws of physics at play and physical processes because of the power that analysing things in those terms has given us. We've made predictions about how things should behave in physical terms. They follow those predictions. It sort of looks like it's all just physical. Is that a fair restatement of your argument?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, to me, and I understand that this is going to be sort of shaky ground for yourself. But just to respond to that, because I do need to, otherwise I'm going to have to think about changing to being a physicalist. So I would say that I will grant you that the world definitely seems to be following these mathematical laws, these sort of physical laws, from my own point of view, because I see my consciousness as having an effect on the world. For me, I've already accepted the idea that there is more than just physical law unfolding at play here. For me, I feel like I have choices. I take that idea that I have choices and that I impact reality very seriously, if not for the reason that that's the way that most human beings want me to actually act out my life. Most human beings want me to behave as if I'm making choices, as if I'm doing things. I feel like I have to put effort into a day to make things happen. It feels like I'm the one doing it. And there's an awful lot of this, and it seems to permeate for our entire society. It seems to be the way that our court systems are built up, for example. And so I ascribe agency to consciousness, and I want to really be very serious about the point that the physical sciences have been tremendously useful to us, been tremendously powerful, and they have made these fantastic predictions. My understanding of physicalism isn't saying that physical stuff's important and seems to be primary. It's almost an absolutist position. Physicalism to me seems to be well, that's all there really is at the fundamental layer, at the fundamental level even, that all we've got are physical processes. And I mean, I just don't see how you can possibly get consciousness out of that. That's the reason why I go the way that I do. And then when I accept that consciousness is having an effect on the world, then for me that seems to be the thing that defeats physicalism. It seems to me like there is this evidence, and that's just my sort of response to that. Have you got anything that you'd like to comment on?
Sure.
To that?
So I'm happy to admit that our current understanding of physicalism can't explain consciousness. Happy to grant that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that all physical stuff is understood by our current understanding of physical stuff. So that seems to be the mistake that you would be making there, is that because our current understanding of physics can't explain consciousness, therefore there must be something beyond physics, essentially, is kind of like a paraphrase. Whereas I think that why not just have it be more physics that we can't understand yet? Like, it doesn't make sense to me to exclude
I can help
physics.
there. So the way that I reach that particular rationale is fairly straightforward. So if we're talking about, so we've got to be very careful here about how we're defining physics, I think. If we're talking about stuff that can be understood in terms of mathematical laws, right? So mathematical relationships, because that seems to be what physics is to me, and maybe you can educate me more here as well. But it's everything that I've seen in physics, everything that I understand it to be, is a set of equations that describe how an initial state of the universe progresses into a more advanced state. Would you say that's relatively fair?
Sort of, but sort of not. So the equations are a language. We're just using language to describe something that's there. So physics is obviously a methodology to construct that language. But what we care about in physics isn't the language. The math, don't care. Doesn't matter. We can just get rid of all the math and the physics is still there. So the physics refers to the constituent parts, the fields, the particles, those kinds of things are what we're talking about. The
territory.
Yeah. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying physics. There's some thing there made of energy, and that thing made of energy is producing consciousness, presumably. And so if physicalism is true, then there is something there, some interaction between these things that we describe with mathematical equations or other things that we haven't discovered yet, which may or may not be describable by mathematical equations. We have no idea what the limits of what physical reality contains might be. So obviously, our current understanding of physics is just particles, matter, and motion, which we can describe with equations. But that doesn't mean there's more to physics. Like the whole idea of information being a thing and that there's no space-time. Space-time is emergent from other things. Like these ideas are completely incoherent to me. I don't know what this even means. But because reality is so weird, I don't think that it matters very much that it's hard for us to understand it. Like to place limits on physics and say, well, no, it's only the equations. If for it to count as physics, it has to be describable by equations. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that we should place those kinds of limits on physics. I think that even if we take physics off the table and just say, we think there's this fundamental stuff, which is like the atoms or whatever, or then there's another potential fundamental stuff of consciousness. I don't think we should include consciousness as fundamental as the mattery stuff, because it just seems to not have as much of an impact on the world, whereas the mattery stuff seems to have much more of an impact on everything we see. And so I don't think trying to limit the field of physics to being things we can describe with mathematical equations and then saying, maybe we can't describe consciousness with a mathematical equation, therefore it's a new kind of thing unto itself rather than just some kind of an emergent property of other physical things we just don't understand yet. I still think taking the approach that it is an emergent property of those physical thingies in some way is a better approach.
Let me pass that. So the physics equaling these mathematical equations is not fair. And I have some sort of sympathy with that, but the reason that I'm trying to do that is because I'm very aware that what we could do is we could just have physics expand to fill any territory that we wanted. We could say, everything is physics, but this thing isn't physics. It is now, I just made it so. I just included it in the definition. So that's the reason. I have the same sort of issue with naturalism. It would seem that anything that we can encounter and then interact with and then sort of describe and make sense of would you could reasonably say would be natural. It seems to be an ever-expanding term that can encompass anything. And so I suppose that's the reason why I'm trying to put some sort of limits on my conception or conceptual understanding of what physics can be. If we could say that we've got physics, which is this mathematical, okay, let me be very careful how I phrase this. If we've got physics, which we can represent with mathematical equations, regardless of the difference between the map and the territory, we can represent it, we can predict its behaviour, we've got it, right? It's in these sorts of mathematical equations. The sort of thing that you'd probably want if you were working for CERN on a t-shirt, right? If we then go along and say that consciousness is affecting things, but it can't be modelled by these equations in the same way, I guess my concern is, well, couldn't you just then say, well, consciousness is just a part of physics? I mean, do you see what I'm getting at here? It's almost, does it become a word game after a while?
Well, sort of. I think the real question, because, yeah, we get lost in the semantics a lot, but I think the real question is if we understand that consciousness exists in some sense and matter exists in some sense, and they're both in reality, where in the hierarchy of reality are they?
Right.
Is matter over here and consciousness over here, and they're separate things and they're equally fundamental? Or is matter the baseline and then consciousness is some emergent property of some combination of different kinds of mattery things? Or is it the other way around? So we're asking more about where the order of operations of reality, essentially. What is the more fundamental thing? And it seems more reasonable to me to think that consciousness, wherever or whatever it is not even close to as fundamental as the energy stuff we know about in physics. The energy stuff we know about using the equations, quantum fields, whatever, seems to be far more fundamental. So even if we don't know what consciousness is or where it is, it definitely seems to be less fundamental, like not even close to the base level of the quantum fields thingy. So it's not even close to that when it comes to fundamentality of the universe. So it seems, even though we don't know what consciousness is yet, it seems more reasonable to place it at a much higher level as an emergent or follow-up to the more base level of the physics we know about. And as we get closer to the fundamental nature of reality, we'll discover more of those kinds of fieldy, physicsy, fundamental stuff. And I don't think we're going to ever discover consciousness there. I think we're going to discover more really interesting things. And interactions between those interesting things are what's going to produce consciousness. Consciousness being an emergent property of whatever that fundamental stuff is, but consciousness itself not being there.
Right. Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose what I'd say is that I think we have a problem when it comes to when we're using the word emergent, in the sense that we could say that, say, for example, snowflake is emergent from water and cold, and maybe some, like a dust particle to seed it. Something like that, right?
Yeah, that's fair. So let's clarify emergence there. So
yeah.
I think consciousness is more like an organ, like a heart. It is a thing that is built of other things. None of those things that build the heart itself is itself a heart. And so, like, our consciousness is a thing built of other things, none of which themselves are consciousness. So I think it's an emergent property of non-conscious things.
The reason that I believe the other way around, right? So the reason why I think of it as being fundamental is because I've been brought up, educated with this idea in science that we can describe things in terms of fundamentals, right? So we could talk about chemistry, but what we'd really be doing is talking about another layer of physics. We're not really describing anything more than quarks, electrons, atoms, stuff like that. They're just doing their normal business. It's not like chemistry is somehow another level, which then changes the underlying level. So it doesn't pop up and then start tinkering around with the mechanics of physics. It's just physics at a different level of complexity. So that allows us to reduce chemistry entirely down to physics. And my issue with consciousness being emergent is that if we were to be able to say that consciousness was merely like Steve Novella, right? That sort of The mind is what the brain does. If we were to accept that as truth, then what we'd be saying is that all of our actions as human beings can be reduced down to those quarks and electrons again, right? Just at the very base of things. It's reducible down to those atoms. But the moment that we accept that, the moment that we see consciousness as this emergent thing, and I suppose really I'm talking about as a weakly emergent thing, then so someone could tell me that they're conscious, and I'd be able to look at them and go, yeah, laws of physics said that. It wasn't them. They're just this, they're not much different from a rock, right? Because any reports that they have of any of their feelings or something like that, it really is just the same physics that's underwriting everything else, that's then leading to this emergent phenomenon. So this is really that difference in philosophy that I've found between weak emergence, where that doesn't really get you consciousness, it sort of gets you illusionism, and strong emergence, and that happened in my talk with David Long, for example, where people feel that consciousness has such a reality to it that it has to sort of strongly emerge. And that's where we get back to that idea of saying that consciousness is a level of emergence where it starts monkeying around with those physical laws underneath. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's not purely reducible to the bottom layer of reality from which things emerge.
Well, so that's where I was talking about earlier. It's not purely reducible to the stuff we currently know about, but let's suppose we discovered some new fundamental stuff, some new fundamental particles or whatever. And these new fundamental particles have this new property that can't be described by math. We need some other language to describe it. And interactions of these new things will produce consciousness between these things and the material things. Now we can have consciousness, which doesn't exist in these fundamental particles anywhere, just be a property of these particles. And our consciousness emerged from the interactions of these new particles and then the known particles in our brain, and they're working together to produce our consciousness. Where would you see a problem with that? Why would our consciousness, being emergent of more fundamental things, diminish it in any way?
Well, it would only diminish it if the utterance of saying to somebody else that I'm a conscious being was reducible to something that wasn't me, because that seems logically incoherent.
Wait, just to clarify. So, like, wouldn't that be contingent, like, just a fact of reality? Like, if you say you're conscious and I'm supposedly an omniscient being who knows everything, I could just say, facts of reality, Matthew's conscious, yep, know it. And that has nothing to do with you. That's just a fact of reality. Wouldn't that be an example of what you just said?
But I think that sort of bypasses our epistemology, and I think that's very important. So I'll just give you my quick epistemological grounding, if you like, and then you can sort of poke any holes in it or critique it or do whatever you like with it. I start off from that sort of extreme skepticism point of view, the René Descartes thing. Doubt as much as you possibly can. What's the one thing you can't doubt? Your own existence. Then I work from sort of this solipsistic point of view, and I say other people are real. So I'm very happy with other minds. I'm convinced that other people are real, other minds exist. That then leads me to posit a shared world, right? So I go, well, there's got to be this medium that these minds are communicating through. And I also happen to notice that the people that I know seem to be a product of food that their parents ate, right? Their food got rearranged and blimey, turned into them. So it seems like these minds do appear to emerge from this shared world. And so this is where all of the epistemology comes from for me. But so I can't really undermine those earlier levels. In order to get shared minds, I had to acknowledge that my own mind was able to communicate with a different mind. When I take on something like a shared world, I then have sort of these minds that are communicating through this shared world. And I really do want to make sure that I don't evade your question here, but there are a lot of thoughts going around my head. So I think you were trying to get at, why can't we have something like proto-conscious particles, or something that the particles that aren't conscious don't necessarily follow the mathematical laws, but somehow them interacting is what causes consciousness, something like that?
Sort of, yeah. That was one of my first questions, but I'm kind of more interested in what you said after that. Like you said that if you reduce consciousness to just some fact, like if you could just read off the facts of physics and know you're conscious without any reference to you, that somehow undermines consciousness. But that's very confusing to me, because obviously if there is an omniscient God, he can just read off the facts of reality, and he doesn't need any reference to any conscious being to know this. He's just facts. Matthew's conscious. Yep. It's fact number 3,337,000, whatever. It seems like anything in reference to reality is going to be on some kind of a fact sheet, just a propositional truth kind of a thing. And
Okay.
our consciousness would be able to be described on that fact sheet just like any other. So wouldn't that, it seems confusing to me that when you say that knowing consciousness by this fact sheet would somehow diminish consciousness, I don't understand why that would follow.
Well, for me, part of what defines consciousness isn't just the fact that I think I want to try and accept this idea of a fact sheet, although it has, I have issues with it, because it's like, well, how do I know there's a fact sheet? How do I know that? How do I know the things on it are facts, right? There's a lot there, but let me try and embrace the idea anyway. I suppose I'd be, you know what? I would be looking for somewhere else on the fact sheet to see what consciousness was, if that was the case, to see if I could understand what it said there. If the fact said, if this thing said Matthew is consciousness and that's a fact, well, that's great. How do I gain access to this fact sheet? It diminishes it for me, because it's not just a question of arbitrarily declaring consciousness to be true, but it's that root epistemology of going, well, how do I know it's true? You know, I've really tried to seriously consider illusionism. I've thought about what Daniel Dennett said. I've pondered it, and it's almost felt like it made my brain crash and reboot. You know, it's that sort of stuff. And
like imagining pure nothingness. I remember trying to do that as a kid, and it just melts your brain.
Whatever I imagine, I've made a mistake. Rubbish. Yeah, I know what you mean. Oh, wow. Right, yeah. So, I love what David Chalmers says about this, and a lot of my thoughts and thinking has been influenced tremendously by David Chalmers, the hard problem of consciousness, the meta problem of consciousness. I love the meta problem of consciousness in particular. It seems to be where I'd be doing a lot of arguing from, but let's try and... So, I recognise my own consciousness for me subjectively, but I get this idea that other people can't know for sure that I'm conscious, that it's something that they have to infer. And so I suppose the fact that we've been able to do that, right? The fact that we've been able to advance to the position where I can go, I'm conscious, I think you're conscious, and you go, and you get what I'm saying, and you'd reciprocate, right? That's quite an extraordinary position to reach, and I think that just declaring it as a brute fact without understanding your workings somehow diminishes it. And it lends us open to this idea that perhaps consciousness can exist as a purely passive thing, and it just seems such an incoherent idea to me that consciousness could exist as a completely passive thing. Now, don't get me wrong, I have no idea what power it has. So I can't tell you that it does loads of things, or if it just has a very small effect, right? So I don't want to seem like I'm bundling something else along with it. I just know that it at least does something. That's how I reason it for myself anyway.
Sure. I mean, so even if we go back and just grant that consciousness does something, if we're going to place it on the hierarchy of reality, like what seems to do the most? Well, quantum field seems to do the most of everything. It seems to have the most impact on reality. And if we compare that to consciousness, what does consciousness seem to be able to do? It's significantly farther down the list. Like if we just measure things in the universe, consciousness is down there with rocks, or probably less than rocks of what it does in the universe overall. But I'm still kind of confused between your application of epistemology versus ontology, because to me, the facts list of the universe is the ontology. I think there is an ontology of reality. There are just facts that describe what reality is like. And then our epistemology of how we try to get to that is kind of like the chemistry to physics thing you mentioned earlier. Like our epistemology makes no difference to the ontology. Ontology doesn't care about our epistemology. Our epistemology is describing or trying to get to the ontology. And so it seems like you're doing the opposite, where you're using the chemistry, the epistemology, to try and influence the ontology. You're saying that because this is the way we can approach knowledge, or because we can gain knowledge in this way, then we can infer something about the ontology by the way our epistemic means of getting it. We get it through consciousness, therefore consciousness itself is fundamental, is one of the more base level things to reality. I don't think that is the correct way to assess what level consciousness would be at. To me, it seems more like assessing what does more in the universe, what has more of an impact as far as we can tell, would be a better way to assess where consciousness should be placed on the hierarchy of real stuff. And as I said before, I think consciousness is nowhere near the bottom. I think the bottom, the core of reality, quantum fields, is about as good as we can get. And physics seems to accurately describe the relation between base particles, quantum fields, to bosons and gluons, to protons and neutrons and electrons, and just build up from there. It seems like that is correct. I think that the physics description of reality is correct. And even though we don't know where consciousness is, if we use the physics description of reality as a baseline and say, where should we put this consciousness thingy, even though we don't know where it is yet, I think it's going to go really close to the brains. It's going to fit really, really close to where we put brains on the thing. And it's not going to go any further or more fundamental down the list than that.
I think that's a very reasonable place to come at things from. This idea that, it's let's not put it any further down the list than we have to. But I suppose I'm persuaded, rightly or wrongly, that there is no causal things that happen above physics. So if you want to have an impact in the world, you have to get underneath physics. You have to change the expression of physics. Because everything else is just that higher level product. It's a one-way street, right? If you have consciousness doing stuff and you want consciousness to do stuff higher up the stack of physics, so, physics, chemistry, biology, and we speculate mind, well, how is mind going to change what's going on in physics? Because it can't just change stuff at the high level. I mean, that's my understanding of physics.
Why not?
Well, why not? No, that's a great question, right?
Well, yes. So I just want to jump in for a second. So yeah, when I'm imagining what you're saying, it seems like there are things that could influence physics at the higher level and not influence at the lower level. Like, for example, suppose ghosts exist or God exists or whatever, and the ghost lives in a supernatural realm outside of the natural world. It comes in, it waves a wand and casts a spell or whatever, and it trips somebody. It says, I think it would be funny if that guy fell on his face. He trips the guy falls on his face. So he interacts with the guy on the high level, but doesn't change anything about the quantum fields, can't touch the quantum fields, can't touch any of the fundamental stuff, but he can still knock the guy over. So he can, it seems, I don't see a logical contradiction with the idea that you could affect just the higher levels without needing to be more fundamental than physics itself.
Oh, sure, right. So in that example, so we've got to go trip somebody up on the street, right? And if he trips him up on the high level, well, the high level can't detach from the lower levels, right? So if his head is going to fall to the pavement, that means all the chemicals that constitute his head have to now move towards the pavement. All the atoms, all the subatomic particles that constitute those atoms, all have to move towards the pavement. We have this problem that we can't detach the higher level from the lower level. And that's the issue, right? That's the reason why if the ghost is going to trip our friend up, it can't just trip the friend up on the higher levels. All the subatomic particles have to move. It has to be completely expressed within physics, and so it has to affect the lower level from which everything emerges.
Well, sure, it has to affect the lower level, but it doesn't change the law of gravity. It doesn't change any of the fundamental forces. All it's doing is affecting the forces that are already there. So it's like if you wanted to change gravity, I would think that you would have to be more fundamental than gravity. But to affect gravity, you don't have to be more fundamental than gravity. So I think there's a difference between the perception that you can influence something that's already there versus fundamentally change it at its core. And I think that consciousness or the ghost can influence the laws that are there and interact with them in some way without necessarily having to be more fundamental to fundamentally change everything about gravity.
Right, so this is really interesting. How do we affect a physical law without changing it? Because I'm trying to, because I think you've furnished us both with a fantastic example here, right? It's an amusing example. It's kind of funny. It's something fun to play with. We've got this ghost, and he's got to trip up somebody who's walking along the pavement, and how is he going to do this?
Increases the mass of his foot. How's he going to do this
without affecting?
So all he does is essentially increase the mass of his foot or whatever. So he's just saying the mass is there. I can't change gravity. Gravity's there, but I can add mass. Like I can just add a proton there or something. I can just add some of the already existing physics. or could move the air so it just blocks his leg or whatever. So it's just affecting the things that are there without actually changing any of the laws of physics.
Right, so we've got those, to pan back to the start of the universe, as you do. We've got this initial state, we've got these physical laws that sort of describe really beautifully how we go from one state to another. And to get our guy to fall over on the pavement, instead of changing the physical laws, we're changing the initial state. We're adding something to the universe that wasn't there before.
Well, not the initial state. So I'd say like the ghost is outside of the universe. Big Bang happens, 13 billion years pass. The ghost comes into the universe, materializes. So it enters into the physical world in some way to cause physical changes at that time without changing anything about the initial states, doesn't change anything about the laws of physics. It just enters into the laws of physics, or enters into the physical universe as a rock or whatever, for the guy to trip over.
Okay. So we're sort of transplanting matter from one universe that we don't understand into this universe that we do understand, and when that matter has been brought in, it affects an outcome.
Right, so like you convert supernatural matter to regular matter.
Ooh, right, wow. Okay, well, that's interesting. You've kind of got me there. Yeah, I'd honestly just not considered the content of the universe as we know it to be variable like that. All right, you've given me something new to think about there. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, okay. Where would we like to move to from there? Because I can't counter that.
I have no idea. I don't know. I think we've talked over most of the major points. Do you have you heard of Richard Brown? Have you had him on your show?
I haven't yet.
He is a good friend of mine. He's a professor in Concordia. I don't remember which college in New York somewhere. And he's been on my show a few times. I think he would be great for you to interview. I think you'd really enjoy talking with him as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, so I suppose I know what I should do here. So I accept what you're saying about not necessarily changing the laws, but adding something that wasn't there before. So I did need to answer that question that you set out of the order of operation, consciousness. Where should we put it? And now obviously, I was certainly trying to answer that and sort of explain at least or give a rationale for what I believed. I suppose that the difficulty that we have with sort of adding stuff to the universe or changing the laws, whichever way you do it, right? So we've definitely sort of talked through a couple of different ways of doing it. Whichever one that you do, it does seem, because even if you're going to add, yeah, actually that's it. That's my mind's just still processing that. So even if you're going to add that extra mass, and even if you're going to transplant it from somewhere else, it's still going to be added at the bottom level, isn't it? It's still going to, that extra mass is still going to be stuff that's represented at the bottom level of physics.
Sure. So it's going to enter in at reality. So obviously, anything you do has to have an effect in reality. So it's going to have an effect on that bottom level of absolutely everything. But the ability for the ghost can only change certain things. He's limited in power. He can't just do anything he wants. He can't change gravity. All he can do is convert his own supernatural matter to normal matter. And so it would be completely coherent to have the idea that there is this ghost who can have a particular kind of effect at the higher levels, create matter or whatever, without having any ability to affect the laws of physics or what's going to happen to the matter after he creates it.
Agreed. Yep. I'm with you.
So I would essentially portray consciousness in the same kind of a light where you can have some kind of a emergent property where there's this stuff that happens at this higher level, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the bottom level. So there's no consciousness at the fundamental level. It's just like one of those ghost things where it interacts at this particular level without having any effect at the bottom level.
Right. So it's sort of, it sort of sounds like it is sort of a ghost in the machine in that sort of conception of it. But I feel...
Literally a ghost.
Yeah. I feel that this is described quite well by the idea of strong emergence, that we can have these higher level things that affect what's going on in the world that don't derive from the bottom level. Would you think that's fair to call that a strongly emergent effect that we're sort of playing around with?
Sure. I think there's lots of different ways you could characterize it. I think that would be a fair characterization, possibly.
Excellent. Okay, right, let's have a quick look through where we've been so far and see if there's anything that's missing. Is there anything that comes to your mind as any questions you'd like to ask, or any particular points you'd like to raise?
Not at the moment. I'm just processing through what we've said so far. I think it's been a really great conversation. I've enjoyed coming on. I really appreciate you having me on.
Fantastic. I've really enjoyed it as well, Tom. Thank you. Yes.
I'm envious of your accent also.
Oh, thank you very much. I think you've got a very nice accent yourself.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've got, testing predictions. We've got consciousness order of operations. You know what? I'm fairly happy just to sort of wrap it up there if there's nothing else that we'd like to cover.
Sure, that sounds good to me. I've, again, really enjoyed the conversation. I think we covered all the good, basic, huge topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. 3 weeks of thinking later, and I've reached a preliminary conclusion that Tom's position is not consistent. I want to know what the novel testable predictions are that validate physicalism over other philosophies of mind, because I don't think they exist. I stand by what I said in the interview. For me, I think Tom is having his cake and eating it. If philosophy is just people making stuff up, then the philosophy of physicalism is just people making stuff up. You can't have it both ways. And let's not forget that we can make highly reliable, testable predictions about consciousness. It's just the problem is they're not novel. I can make a prediction that when I ask you how you're feeling, or what does it feel like to be you, that you can answer that. And from your perspective, that should be the end of it. That should be the proof of mind over matter. You know you have a mind, you know you can tell me about it through matter, we're done. I think we should accept that and move on. Now, I am very sympathetic for the desire for these predictions to be novel, and I do understand why that adds value, but I'm really not convinced that Tom's approach is a correct one. Novel, testable predictions may well identify things that are true. I will grant you that. But they don't identify all things that are true. And that's a very, very big problem if you're going to rely on them exclusively. If I had to pick just one other thing to comment on, it would be my shock and surprise that Tom objected to discovering truth through epistemology, because I think that's actually what he's doing with novel testable predictions. He's seeking some way of verifying that what we think is true actually is. So I think that, in a way, me and Tom are kind of on the same page with some of this stuff. We just need to work it out. But discovering truth through epistemology, I don't think you can find truth any other way. It's not enough to speculate. You have to somehow verify. So, yeah, like I say, me and Tom, not as far away from each other as you might think. But what do you think? I hope you liked this video. If you've changed your mind about anything from the conversation you've just watched, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Take it easy, everyone.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.